I'm reading from Genesis 1, starting in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals off the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Then God said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth, and all the fruit trees for your food. And I have given every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life." And that is what happened. Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. The evening passed, and the morning came, marking the sixth day. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation.
For a start this morning, I noticed some of you guys didn't have your Christmas ties. I know it's tough, it's been a year, but grab a Christmas tie. It's our opportunity to celebrate. It's kind of a fun tradition that started several years ago here, just an opportunity, another opportunity for us to fellowship over some things. It's in 2 Chronicles? Is it? I haven't gotten to that one yet. Okay. Well, back in September, Cheryl and I had an opportunity to go visit her brother in England. I never really thought I would get to go there. I'd never been there before. But I want to tell you, if you think U.S. drivers are crazy, they are over there, and the roads are about half as wide. It's just nuts over there. I was sitting in the other side, the normal driver's side, cringing every time we came up to an intersection because it was just crazy over there. But during that trip, Cheryl and I had an opportunity. Keith took us to London's West End Theater to see Agatha Christie's play, The Mousetrap. Has anybody seen that before? That's really pretty cool. There we go. That was the billing for it there. The play was based on one of her many whodunit mysteries. She's a great mystery writer. I love mystery stories. But what really surprised me is this play has been playing in that theater for 70 years, nonstop, nothing else. 70 years it's been playing in that theater. And I would have thought, well, everybody knows who done it, so why would we go to this play? But the crowds still are there. It was hard to even find a place to stand until we could go into the theater. After 70 years, like I said, I figured everybody would know who did it, so things would change, but it hadn't. Still just as popular as anything in the past. Now, neither Cheryl or I are really familiar with the story. I'd heard of it, but I didn't know much about it. So the entire time we're trying to figure out who did it. In part through, I think this person did. I think that person did it. It was an amazing story. It was fun to watch. And one of the things I figured out too, Agatha Christie floats a lot of clues, but a lot of them don't matter. A lot of them aren't real. So you're guessing the whole time during this play. Well, you need to understand that story, even if you know who did it. My guess is most people in London know who did it. To really appreciate that story, you need to go to the backstory. You really need to go back and find out what happened, why things turned out like they did. That's what makes the story really fascinating. When you understand from the beginning how it developed and where it ended up, or why it ended up where it did. Now, I'm going to mention this, or I mentioned this morning, because I think that relates to sometimes how we think about the Christmas story. You know, we all know what happened that night in Bethlehem. We're all familiar with Mary, the young virgin that was given birth to a baby, and the struggles Joseph had with dealing with the whole situation. We know about the star that guided the three wise men to the place where Jesus was living. We know about King Herod, who tried to put to death all the baby children, particularly looking for this one. You know, we understand how that story carries from here through the New Testament, because it's played out so clearly in the Gospels. But we don't spend much time thinking about the backstory, do we? How it got here, how it got to this point. And the backstory is what helps us understand why things evolved like they did, why things happened like we did. And that's what I want to do in this series of messages. In fact, today, Gene read from Genesis chapter 1, really the beginning. We're going to go back to the beginning as we talk about the Christmas story. And that's really what this series is all about. The Christmas story from the beginning. What happened to take us to where we are today? I want to thank you, Gene, for reading our text today. But I'm going to ask you to join me as we ask God to speak to us in prayer this morning. Let's pray. Father, as we come to your story that led to where we are today, Father, open our eyes to the truth. Help us to see your plan more clearly so we would understand the beauty and wonder of Christmas, the magnificence of Christmas this year. Help us not to be caught up in the bright lights and all the things that are a part of Christmas, but to remember what it really is, a picture of your great love for us. So we ask your blessing this morning on this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, the Christmas story, again, is familiar to most all of us. Genesis chapter 1 begins with the creation. We talk about all the events. In fact, I didn't realize when I put this together, many of you studied this in Sunday school or have recently, so you're familiar with it. The big picture look at creation begins with a planet that's dark, no light, waters over the earth. And then God created light and dark, the atmosphere to support life, the dry land, the seed-bearing plants that would become a source of for food. And there was the sun and the moon and the stars, all the universe, and the creation of all kinds of sea creatures and land creatures. And then finally, at the end of that series, she creates mankind. Now, before we move beyond that story, I want us to recognize God didn't just create stuff. He didn't say we need to do all these things. He established an entire ecosystem to support us, to bless us, to care for us. And when he finally created mankind, you'll notice the end of Genesis chapter 3, he said, it was really good. This is exactly what I intended to do. It all came together perfectly. Everything was for our blessing and benefit. And I want you to think about that. Scientists have talked about how vast the universe is. Now, I don't know this for sure, but if we're going to spend eternity in heaven, I think we're going to get to see some of that stuff. I think we're going to get to see some of his magnificent creation in eternity. But again, it was all for us. God's focus was on us. So as we come to the rest of this text, the text that Gene read this morning, we get a glimpse of how his plan unfolds. Turn your Bible to Genesis chapter 1 and look at verse 26, just the start of this. It says, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And we talked a little bit in Sunday school. I was with the senior adult men. That word image, that has been a point of study for theologians for generations. What does it mean? Well, I'm going to give you just kind of a summary, I think, that helps us understand what that image is about. This image is what allows us to have a unique relationship with God. No other creatures are described in that form. They have life, they do things, but man is built for a unique relationship with God. He's given us the abilities to interact with him. Think about that. We can read his word, we can pray to him, we can hear from him. He gave us abilities such as our rationality, our intellectual capability, our emotional capability, and our moral capability. All these in us because these were like him. So he's given us that kind of likeness of God. We're self-aware and we can relate to others. Now, we have a cat that we let in this morning, and I got awakened as he was crawling over my head He can sort of relate to us, but we are nothing like that. We can think and imagine things beyond the right now and the here. That's part of what it means to be made in his image. And verse 27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Mankind is both male and female. This characteristic, of course, is necessary for the very thing he says next in verse 28. Take a look at that. God said, or blessed him and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, there's a common theme I want us to see in this, these verses we've just read, a big picture theme, if you will, about all this that helps us understand God's plan. I hope you can see it, but let me summarize it with these words. God created us with a need for relationships. Let me kind of explain that. Maybe you can see that, but let me explain it a little more. Think about the relationship he created for us so that we could be in connection with him. He created us for a relationship with him. No other creatures are in a situation like that. Then he created the marriage relationship, the most sacred relationship on earth. But he also created us to bear children, to relate to kids, and that will have an impact on the world. All these relationships are things he created for us. He built us that way. That's an important aspect of what it means to be created in his image. We can relate to others, and he's built us for those relationships. Verse 1 of our text talks about, 26, the reference to us and ours had make him in our image. Some theologians have said, well, that's a reference to the Trinity, and I think it probably is. But there's another aspect to that sometimes we don't think about as we think about this text. The fact that Jesus was there at the beginning, John chapter 1. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. Apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So that us does speak of God. It does speak of Jesus. And then verse 1 in Genesis 1 talks about the Spirit moving over. So we get this idea that God is a relational being. He lives in relationship. He lives in that kind of connection. And the point behind all of this, as we look at this text, is the fact that we humans were created in his image, and like our Creator, we were built in a fundamental need for relationships. That's why we gather here. That's why we have families. That's why we have family get-togethers on the holidays. We were built for relationships. First in a relationship with our Creator, and also in a relationship with other people. Now, we could look a little later here in Genesis chapter 2. Adam was busy in the garden, but it said, God looked down at Adam and said, he needs something else. It's not good for him to be alone. So he created Eve to be his partner, to be his helpmate in all this. Why? Once again, because he created us for relationships. I hope you're seeing this in this. He's seeing in this text, you're showing us in this text that we were created to be connected. We were created to be in relationships. Think about the relationships in your life, in your own life, husband and wife, father and mother, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, grandparents, friends, co-workers, those who serve in the community and those who are served in the community. Relationships is what we're all about. God created us to be in community, and he created us to have a role in that community as well. In fact, in our recent series from the book of James, we saw a major emphasis on how we are to get along with each other. Why quarreling and battling and fighting destroys that part that God created in us. But he made a special emphasis how we get along with each other. We need strong relationships. In fact, I was doing a little reading, just looking for some other insights. There was a gentleman named Bernie Siegel. He was an American writer. He was a retired pediatric surgeon. And he made a very profound comment about the importance of relationships. Let me read this to you. He said, single men are jailed more often, earn less, have more illnesses, and die at a younger age than married men. So guys, if you're married, you might live a little bit longer. That's what he's telling us there. Married men with cancer live 20% longer than single men with the same cancer. Women who have more close friendships than men survive longer with the same cancers. Married or not, relationships keep us alive. Without those, we struggle in life. Without those, we get lonely. Without those, there's no purpose in our lives. God built us to live and to thrive in relationships. So as we look at the beginning of this, so we're looking forward to Christmas, but I want you to understand this right. He made us to live in relationships, primarily with him, but also with each other. Well, our focus text also gives us another important aspect of being as an image. I want to put it this way. God created us with a need for purpose, to be about something, to have something to focus on, to occupy our mind and our efforts, our energy, our intellect, however you might want to describe it. Without it, we tend to drift into laziness and sometimes into trouble. Maybe you all know some about that. A couple of texts that I think make this point, both in Proverbs, first from Proverbs. He who is slack in his work is brother to him who destroys. One that's lazy, isn't busy about things, he ends up causing more problems than doing good. Maybe you know that from experience. Then Ecclesiastes, there's nothing better for a man than to eat and to drink and tell himself that his labor is good. And this is from God himself. What this is telling us is God intended us to have a purpose. And one of those purposes was our work, our activities in that nature. Remember, we were created in the image of a God who you might call the ultimate busy creator. Ultimate busy creator. And because we're created in his image, he said, you have that same purpose built into you. Take a look at our text again, verse 26. It says that he created man in his own image. And notice what he told him his task was, man's task, to rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over the earth and over every creeping thing that crawls on the earth. Now, I think about that. Most of you are probably not real excited about bugs. But that really wasn't the point of this thing, that you have to rule over the bugs. The point of this is he gave us the task to care for the world that he created so carefully. He built for us. He says, I want you to take care of it because it was made for you. That's part of your task. And then verse 28 tells them, be fruitful and multiply. To bring children into this world, raise them up, show them what life is about, teach them about me in that relationship so they can carry on that role. Boy, if you're a parent, you know how big a task that is. But that's one of the things he said, this is what I want you to do. Bring these children up understanding me so that they can continue caring for the world that I built. Let me ask you, who here has ever house sat for somebody? Anybody? Have you ever babysitted somebody's kids? Now, young parents, that's probably one of the scariest things you do. The first time you leave your kids with somebody else, even if it's your own parents, because they're your kids. We all can kind of understand it. What they're asking you to do is to treat those things like they're your own. Treat them with that kind of care and attention. In a very real way, church, that was the task God gave us, to care for this world, care for the people in the world, raise our children up in the world so that they would get to know him, but primarily so they could have that relationship with him. They could understand what he's given them. But there's another aspect to this. Look at verse 29. I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. The text tells us that he gave us the plants for food. But it's not until Genesis chapter 2 we recognize that God placed Adam in the garden to cultivate it and keep it. So he gave him another task, to take care of the source of his food. God established the concept of work. The concept of work. Work is about focusing on something bigger than us, something greater than the moment and the benefits that are beyond us. It's a way of contributing to the welfare of the world, part of his task for us. And it reminds us also that we're dependent on each other because we're caring and supporting each other. This was all part of God's plan for our lives. He created us with a need for relationship, and he created us with a need for purpose. So I want you to think about those. Think about need for relationships and need for purpose. Those are both things that he built for. But there's one more thing. At the end of chapter 1, we read that he was very satisfied with his work. Look at verse 31. He'd seen all that he'd made. Behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning and there was sixth day. But then he continues on. It doesn't stop at day 6. Go into chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. But by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done and rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Now let me say right here, that word rested doesn't mean, we talked about it in Sunday school, it doesn't mean he was going, man, that was tough. I need a break. I need to put up my feet, get a Coke, and just kind of rest for a second there. No, he's talking about ceasing his work. He had done what he needed to do. It was time to stop what he was doing. He said he's finished. By the seventh day, he looked at it and said, this is great. So I'm not going to do anything on this seventh day. But one more thing, verse 3. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and made. I want us to focus on something here that's sanctified. I'm going to summarize it this way and try to explain it. Not only did he create us for a need for relationships and a need for purpose, church, he created us with a need for him. A need for him, to be in that relationship with him. And how do I get the idea? First of all, he rested from his creative work, but it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't mean he was tired. Psalms 121:4 says he never tires. So what do all these verses tell us? What's the big picture here? The seventh day that God stopped his work, he sanctified it. You know what the word sanctified means? First of all, it often means holy. It means set apart from all the other days. He set that special day apart as sacred. And the Jews, you know what the Jews called this day? You remember? Sabbath. This was the Sabbath day, a day of rest. So have you ever thought about why God created the Sabbath? What was his point in creating the Sabbath? Well, he never tires, so we knew it wasn't because he was tired. But God knew something about us. He knew that as we were busy in this life with all the work and the activities of this life, that it would so consume our attention that we would forget him. We would forget who it is that prospers our work. Forget that it's God who makes our efforts successful, not our wisdom and not the strength of our hands. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, I think it is, God makes that same point. He says, you need to be careful when you go into the promised land, when you are successful and everything prospers like I promised you it would, that you don't forget that it is me that makes your work successful. And I think that's important for us to remember. And that's why he set this day aside, a day for us to remember that we need to understand that it's God that makes our work successful. God that makes what we do prosper. You remember what Jesus said when the Pharisees talked about the Sabbath. This is his words. He said, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. I think sometimes we Christians are of the mind that we're supposed to observe the Sabbath because that makes God happy. That's some sort of one of those rules that we have to follow. And even today, we still can think of the Sabbath like that somehow we're sinning against God if we're not paying attention to the Sabbath. The point of the Sabbath wasn't to honor God by doing something for him. The point of the Sabbath was God said, I know what you need. You need rest both physically and spiritually, or you will forget me. You'll be so consumed by your focus on money and success and power, whatever it might be, you'll forget that it's me that makes those things happen. So what the Sabbath was his provision for us. And he created us with a need for that. Again, it's no longer required today, but that principle is still essential for us. We need physical and spiritual rest. We need to remember that God's gracious hand is what provides for us. We might think it's because we're smart. We might think it's because we're successful, we're talented, we're great speakers, we can do all these things and impress people. But I got to tell you, and I think I've shared this before, there are a lot of people that have all those qualities, but they still fail. Why? Because it's not them that causes things to prosper. It's our God. We need to remember that. We need to remember that we don't need to go into work on Sunday or whatever day, that seventh day of the week, to get stuff done. We need to remember God fills that gap, that he will take care of those things for us. We know how easy it is to forget that very thing. And it's a lesson we need to learn often, isn't it? That we are not successful because of our own efforts. You know, there's more that we can consider about all this. to help us understand the importance of the Christmas story. And so what does all this got to do with the Christmas story? Why is this important to the Christmas story? Well, as I mentioned earlier, God created us to be in fellowship with him and each other. And as a result of the rebellion of Adam and Eve, when they chose not to obey him, man's relationship with God began to unravel. You're reading in the Old Testament about the kings. We saw how that unfolded. We saw what happened, how often they forgot about God, how often they made unwise decisions. But if you go all the way back again to Adam and Eve, we recognize as soon as their tragic decision took place, it wasn't much later when Cain killed his brother Abel. Followed just a little bit longer. It isn't too much later till Cain's children begin to take lives as well. And the relationships between mankind became adversarial. The world became a dangerous place to live. War, brutality, rather than cooperation and love were a commonplace situation for mankind. We see it still today, don't we? Rather than being good stewards of God's world, man begins to ravage the land for his own benefit. Competition for resources devolves into death and destruction. And rather than trusting God for their safety and prosperity, they abandoned him and began to look to their own efforts. I think we see that in our world today. How many folks say, I can't go to church on Sunday, I got work to do? How many folks say, I want to take a little time off. It's been a great week. I just need to go out, put my feet up, take a Coke on the beach. We begin to think that the way we'll be satisfied in our lives is through our own wisdom, our own power, and our own activities. We see that in the world today everywhere else. Rather than trusting God, we look to ourselves for peace, for security, to address the needs that God created us in us for relationships, for purpose, and for him. And again, we just need to look around us today, how far we've departed from the very things God created us for us to experience. That relationship with him, that relationship with others, purpose in our lives, and the knowledge of him. God would have to step in to fix the problem. Because we see where we're going. We see as we read the Old Testament where man's wisdom took him. Why don't you look with me over to Genesis 3. This is something I've shared before, but I think it's important we see it. Genesis 3, this is the account of the fall of man. I want you to look at verses 6 and 7. Adam and Eve had taken of the fruit. Verse 6 says, the woman saw the tree was good for food. It was delight to the eyes. The tree was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate and gave to her husband, and he ate with her. The eyes of both of them were opened. They knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. Now, again, I pointed this out before. Making clothes from leaves was the best that man could do to fix his situation. That's all he understood. That's all they could do. The very best. Now, you know, clothes like that aren't going to last very long. They're not very good when it's cold. The point of this, how long would that last? How effective would it be? Clearly, it wouldn't have been at all. But then go over to verse 21, chapter 3. This statement just kind of pops out at the end of God's conversation with Adam and Eve and the serpent. It said, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam, his wife, and he clothed them. You know what that's saying to us? I want you to think about this. It's easy for us to miss. Where did God get the skin to make the garments? He had to intervene, and he had to take the life of an animal to take care of Adam and Eve. He had to take a life of an innocent creature, had nothing to do with the problems in the earth, to take care of them. And you need to think about it. Clothes wear out, that would have worn out. There would be more animals who would have to be sacrificed to take care of them. Life in a fallen world was remedied through death. Life in a fallen world was remedied through death. Now, I want you to think for a moment about the Christmas story. What is it really all about? It's about God stepping into the human condition because mankind cannot fix itself. God built us for relationships. He built us with a purpose, and he gave us everything we needed. We needed him, but man rejected the relationships. Man chose to go his own way and follow his own purposes. And man rejected God. And the Old Testament is the story of the results. Life today in our world is the story of those results. But the Christmas story is about a creator God who loved us too much to let us sit back and destroy ourselves. So he steps down into the human condition. See, Christmas isn't just about the miraculous birth in a manger. It's not just about the decorations and all the festivities of Christmas. It's about God's solution to the problem that we're experiencing now. And the only solution was an innocent life brought into the world to be the sacrifice who would offer us a way back to our Creator. Church, that's the Christmas story. And if you don't understand the beginning, you don't really appreciate where this story comes from or what happens to us. It's like the Agatha Christie mystery. You may know what happened at his birth and what happened in the rest of the New Testament, unless you go back and appreciate where God started with us, what he wanted us to experience, what he gave us, and what we did with that, we don't really fully embrace and understand what he did at Christmas. That's why it matters to us. The backstory of Christmas helps us understand why the world is unfolding like it is, but also God's gracious solution. So, church, what do we do with this? As we come to Christmas 2023, the reality is it's just as true today as we need a Savior to rescue us. We're still in the same condition Adam and Eve were, trying to sew together the leaves of our own wisdom and strength and skill to make our lives good, and it doesn't work. It won't last. It can't last because that's not the way the world works, but we still try so hard to make it work. We may be able to hide our nakedness for a while, our need for a while. The wealth and our abundance, especially in the Western world, makes us still feel pretty comfortable. But the truth is we are just as naked as Adam and Eve were in the garden. It'll never last. And we know it, don't we? We know it. We also need to understand that because God is our creator and we're made in his image, only he can fulfill the needs he built into each one of us. Only he can fulfill that need for relationship. Because remember, the primary relationship we're talking about is one with him. If that's not right, then everything else falls apart. Only he can fill that. Our purpose is, instead of making ourselves wealthy, or instead of making ourselves comfortable and pleasant lives, that's not what God assigned us to do. He assigned us to be in a relationship with each other, to raise children when we're married, to be contributing members of the culture. That's our task, to love each other, to support each other, to be a part of caring for each other. He built that into us. But church, there's one more thing I want us to remember as we think about this story. At Christmas, what we're celebrating is the fact that he gave us our greatest need. He gave us himself. So as we think about Christmas, I want you to remember that. Let me ask you this. Is that how you think about Christmas? Is that the way Christmas moves your heart? Because without that backstory, we will forget it. We'll forget what he did and why it's important. It's not just that there was a baby born, not just that he was sinless. This was God stepping down into our world to meet our greatest needs, to give us back the things he built us for, relationships and purpose, and to be connected to him. So as we move on for the rest of this day, we head home. I don't know about you, but Cheryl and I were talking about getting the tree out and starting some of the decorating. Those are all wonderful things. But let's remember why we do that. Let's remember why it's important. And let's remember that without him, it'll all just fade away. It'll mean nothing for us. It won't solve our problems. It won't make us happy at the deepest level. So I'm going to ask you just for a few minutes to bow your head. And I want you to speak to God about maybe what he said to you today. Where do you need to maybe think differently about Christmas? What do you need to be saying to him right now? Have you let yourself be caught up with the things of the world and forgotten what Christmas is all about? Just take a few moments to speak to him.